Today we have with us in our studio Ambassador Gutierrez to talk about regional alliances, grand strategy, and mass migration. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here. It's a great honor.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
Is there international order, and what keeps that order in place?
It's a messy world right now. After World War II, even during the Cold War, there was a semblance of international order dictated by the creation of the UN and the allies, the Security Council, the UN agencies like the World Bank and the IMF. And even during the Cold War, the world was more predictable, and the rules of the game were more or less followed, with a few exceptions here and there. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the USSR and their allies in Eastern Europe, the world has become, there was a new world order under President George H.W. Bush for a while, where the U.S. was the primus inter pares. But in recent years, we have seen the emergence of China. We have seen a more aggressive Russia. And we have seen the non-state actors playing more and more of a role. So gone are the days where states were measured by the size of their armies and armed forces. These days, all elements come into play: economic power, terrorism, drugs, you name it. There are a lot of factors that factor in the world order. So it's a messier world with more players, in a way less control, but still there are some constants from which we can build. The NATO alliance is still there. I think it's imperative to preserve it. The United Nations, albeit weakened in some instances, is still playing an important role with peacekeeping and the UN agencies. And there are some regional organizations too, like the OAS, the OAU, and others. So it is a messier world, but there's still room for working together for the nations.
Would you say that the state itself is still the central actor in the international system, or is it being replaced?
I don't think it's being replaced. I mean, states are still there. They still have votes at the UN. But you have to take into account the non-state actors as well. When an ISIS takes over large portions of the Middle East, when an Al-Qaeda can work its will in some parts of the world, you have to take all these non-state actors into account. But it's still the nation state that is the most important entity. Now, some of the nation states are changing. We have seen efforts to break up some of the major states in Canada, in England, the United Kingdom, and other places. We saw the Czech Republic and Slovakia going their separate ways to form two new nations out of Czechoslovakia. So these are factors that I think you'll see more and more of. In the Balkans, of course, the wars after the end of the Cold War have led to the creation of 3 new states in the former Yugoslavia, but actually 4 new states. But so the situation is a fluid one in many parts of the world, but still the nation state is important.
Do you think that the Cold War provided a lot of stability and a lot of predictability to the international order, and that since the Cold War you just see an unraveling of that predictability and stability?
It was a little more complex than that. I would not say stability, because there were still actions taken by states that were destabilizing. The Soviet Union invading Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, and civil wars breaking out in Central America, in Angola, Mozambique, Southern Africa, etc., with surrogate states being supported by the Soviet Union and their allies, and the U.S. and its allies. But at least you know who the enemy was. You knew where the missiles were pointed at.
Right.
So it was a more understandable playing field than what you have now.
Okay. And did that bipolar nature make it less confusing for a lot of, I guess, diplomats and
Well, certainly,
actors.
as a diplomat, which I was from 1977 to 2006, I knew where the enemy was. I knew who the enemy was. And the U.S. and the Soviet Union tended to view the world more or less in a bipolar way. Which states are with us, which states are against us. Some of that was very overly simplistic. There were conflicts that had nothing to do with East and West. But certainly, I mean, it was a reality. When Soviet missiles were pointed at American cities, you had to take that into account. And it was a more dangerous world in a way, but a more predictable world.
Okay. And so you said that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was, I guess, U.S. predominance, and you'd say a unipolar, I guess, period. Are we still in a unipolar period with America at the top, or are we seeing really a unipolar, multipolar environment being created?
I think you're moving more toward a multipolar environment. I mean, the emergence of China as an economic and military power, I think, is very significant. The aggressiveness of the new Russia under Vladimir Putin, the U.S. policies of withdrawing from several parts of the world, of focusing on fighting with our friends and reaching out to our enemies in some instances, I think have really confused the picture these days. The U.S. at times shows no interest in leading the Western alliance, et cetera. So it's moving, I think, more toward a multipolar world. I do think the United States is still the indispensable nation, the most important nation, and the key player. But we're seeing an erosion of U.S. influence, self-imposed, under this administration, I would say.
Okay. Is there a grand strategy? Do we have a grand strategy that's driving our political decisions at the international level?
Well, you know, we Americans are an impatient lot. We have never been overly good at long-term planning. I would say the Chinese probably have a 1,000-year plan. The Catholic Church certainly looks at the world through millennia. We, in an era of instant social media and instant news, we have no patience sometimes to plan. I was director of policy planning at one point in the Western Hemisphere Bureau of State. Did I have time to think great thoughts and look ahead? No, there was a crisis a day that we had to deal with. So that's the nature of our business. I do think the Pentagon has some planners that look at possible conflicts ahead, but we don't do such a good job. We do come out with a strategy every couple of years. The administrations come up with a national security strategy. But these, in recent years, have become more or less a Christmas tree of everything the administration wants to tell the world that it's doing. We are for climate change. We are for the rights of women, et cetera. But it's not really looking at, you know, a Metternich or Kissinger type worldview. I do think we are taking into account other elements of power, other in the military these days. But we're also ignoring some of the tools in our arsenal. For example, diplomacy. Diplomacy has been shunted aside by this administration. And I think that's a serious mistake.
Do we have, I guess, a vision? And are we operating at a large, comprehensive level? Are we integrating the economic security and economic levers with the military levers, with the diplomatic levers? Are we approaching a lot of these problems in a whole of government perspective?
There are some planners, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, maybe at the state INR Bureau, et cetera, that do come up with plans and contingencies and things like that. But the problem is, who's reading them? Who's taking them into account? It seems to me that the president is his own chief advisor in foreign policy when he decides to meet with Kim Jong-un without any experts or anything. But we go back to President Obama's reaching out to Cuba at the end of his administration, which he did with 18 months of secret talks without bringing in the State Department or other experts into the equation. So unfortunately, I think we're ad hocing a lot of our foreign policy without really taking a comprehensive look.
Right. What about India and Brazil and other, regional powers? Are we, re-engaging them at the level we should be?
I think there has been a movement in U.S. agencies to take a closer look at India and China and to put some of our resources into these emerging areas. We have traditionally put most of our resources in Europe and the former Soviet Union and lately in the Middle East, but we have to take a look at India, Brazil, the BRICS, so-called BRICS, and Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as emerging players. India and China certainly are worth a comprehensive look and to take into account. I think we're putting more resources into those countries. More U.S. consulates, for example, are opening up, but probably not enough.
Right. So what is the U.S. role in maintaining international order?
Well, that depends on the administration. At one point, we were the beacon of freedom for the world, and we stood up for democracy all over the world. We supported democratic movements. In recent years, I think we have moved away from that. And certainly in this administration, there seems to be no major effort to support democracy. But even under the Obama administration, at the end of the Bush administration, we saw more of a let's all just get along and not be judgmental type of foreign policy. And I think the U.S. is at its best when it supports its ideals. At the same time, you have to be pragmatic. You have to deal with Saudi Arabia. You have to deal with governments who are not perfect. But our bottom line should be support for those who fight for freedom.
Right.
And I'm not seeing a lot of that these days.
Right. What's the role of international organizations and NATO, an example, and the EU as an example, in maintaining world order?
Well, I think they're pretty much indispensable. There has to be a forum where nations can sit down and talk and resolve their differences. So the UN, to me, is indispensable. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't fight for a more equitable effort from all countries, be it in the UN and NATO, etc. The U.S. cannot bankroll all these organizations. So I don't criticize President Trump for trying to get NATO countries to spend more, etc. But certainly that should not be done by, breaking up personal relationships and alliances that have withstood the test of time. So we do need these organizations. We do need and we do need to reform them. So because, for example, the Human Rights Commission at the UN has been pretty much a joke for many years. And I don't have a problem with the U.S. withdrawing or calling for its reform from these groups. But at the same time, we cannot walk away altogether. We need to stay in there. We need to work with our allies. We need to continue to work with the democracies of the world.
Right.
And that should override any desire to, for example, force them to spend more money on NATO or have more equitable trade relations with the U.S. I mean, these are countries that have fought together, worked together all these years to make a more perfect world. Let's not, just break up with them.
Right, right. So is the U.S. leadership in those organizations critical, or can we take a smaller role in those organizations?
I think it's critical. I think everybody looks to the U.S. as the biggest country, the country with a track record to stop fascism in World War II and to defeat communism in the Cold War. If not the U.S., who? If not now, when? So we cannot walk away from that, I don't think.
Does the U.S. use its economic levers effectively, do you think, in influencing international relations?
At times it has. I think, for example, the sanctions on South Africa led to a government change there. In other areas, we have not been as successful. We'll see in the cases of Iran and North Korea whether these sanctions ultimately prove to have been beneficial. I think we have to look at all the arrows in our quiver. We have to look at economic power. We have to look at what Joe and I call soft power. We have to look at world organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, where the U.S. plays a critical role, and use all these tools, because we cannot send the 82nd Airborne to resolve the problems of the world.
Right.
We have to do it through diplomacy, coercion if necessary, negotiation.
Right.
etc.
Well, the U.S. has been called the world policeman or international policeman. Do you think the U.S. should have that role? Do you think it's an accurate description? Should we do more policing internationally or less?
No, I don't think it is our role to be the world's policeman. We have to stand up for certain ideals.
Right.
And we have to keep our word. That's the thing. We cannot make threats that we cannot follow through on. We cannot draw red lines and then just ignore them.
Right.
But at the same time, we cannot be everywhere, and we cannot risk American lives in every conflict. So we have to be wise about it. We have to use our allies. We have to support those fighting for freedom without necessarily bringing in U.S. troops. But there may be occasions where we need to have U.S. troops.
Let's talk about the UN then in detail, if you can. You said some bodies in the UN were more effective and other bodies weren't effective, and you talked about reforming some of those bodies. Which areas have been effective for the UN and which areas have not been effective?
Well, I think peacekeeping has been a useful arm in many places to keep, for example, in the Sinai, to keep Israel and Egypt together. Apart after some of the wars that they fought. In places like the Balkans, they're still there, keeping ethnic groups from killing each other. So peacekeeping can be an action short of a shooting war in many instances. I do think that, for example, some of the human rights commissions and things like that become more of a collegial group without any teeth and are not that useful. Other international organizations like the International Criminal Court, for example, which the U.S. is not a member of, but it plays a role in telling human rights abusers that they will have no place to hide once they leave power. But we need to do more. And the IMF and the World Bank have played useful roles. The IMF has tended to be a little too draconian in dealing with third world countries. We need to be wiser about what policies are applied to these countries which are trying to, survive in many instances. But at the same time, countries have to be held accountable. So there is some room for improvement in the UN, and the U.S. cannot be the sole contributor or the chief contributor. Others have to chip in as well. I remember I spent some time with former UN ambassador Richard Holbrooke, and he had a unique style of telling countries that they had to contribute, using many, whether it be yelling, screaming, or being charming. But he did a good job, for example, in reducing the percentage that the U.S. contributed to peacekeeping, while others had to fill the gap. So we have to do more of that, I think.
Let's talk about the Organization of American States. What is its function, and has it been effective?
Well, traditionally, some critics had called it a place where diplomats go to retire in Washington, D.C., without being very effective. Recently, however, starting with 2001, where they signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the OAS has started to grow some teeth. They declared that the OAS had to be a democratic club. Only democratic countries need apply. No dictatorships will be accepted. And countries that did not have the right to undermine their own democracies, which in Latin America was a tremendous departure, because sovereignty had been the key word. One does not get involved in their neighbors' affairs. So in recent years, the OAS has been a little more critical. And I think after we saw events like the genocide in Rwanda and others, countries came to the conclusion that they cannot sit idly by and just, you know, leave sovereignty as a key indicator for these countries. We have to work together to prevent genocides, to prevent mass killings, etc. And in Latin America, the message was slow in coming, but I think people are starting to get it. We see now collective action being taken against the Maduro regime in Venezuela and in other places. So the OAS is proving to be a little more effective than it has in the past. It still isn't where I'd like it to be. I'd like to have more teeth, but it's moving that direction under the new Secretary General Almagro from Uruguay, who's been a very iconoclastic Secretary General.
So is state sovereignty eroding, the concept of state sovereignty eroding in the international system now?
Well, state sovereignty is a key component, but state sovereignty cannot be a cloak behind which governments violate the human rights of their own people. That is unacceptable. There are universal rights that would trump state sovereignty, as we saw in Rwanda with the massacre of the Tutsis. And I think when those conditions occur, then countries do have the right to get involved.
Is it different now than it was in the past?
Well, in Latin America, it certainly is. There is less reluctance for countries to openly criticize their neighbors when these things happen, as they're happening in Venezuela right now.
Okay. Is there a movement of democratization that's going through Latin America now?
Well, we saw that movement. I mean, I think the height of the movement was in 1992, when the Summit of the Americas took place, where 34 out of the 35 countries got together, and all the leaders had been elected democratically, and 2 were women. This was a major departure for Latin America, because if you go back to '67 at Punta del Este, when the leaders of the hemisphere met, about half of them answered to the title general and wore military uniforms. So the hemisphere had come a long way in 25 years. Now, what we saw in the 2000s was a reaction after the fall of communism and the advent of democracy to democratic rule in the form of populism. And you saw the Hugo Chávez's in Venezuela of the world, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Kirchner in Argentina, starting to adopt more of a vague third world rhetoric, populistic speech, which pretty much downplayed the traditional democratic institutions and the idea of the opposition being treated as, say, Her Majesty's loyal opposition. In this case, not Her Majesty's, but the opposition being respected. Because heretofore in Latin America, it had been winner take all. There had been no history of compromise. We're moving away from that in the 1990s, but then with the advent of populism, we went back a little bit. Hugo Chavez talking about participatory democracy, which to him was a different kind of democracy, and changing the rules of the game. Now you're seeing a reaction against that in the hemisphere, and I think that's a good thing.
What about corruption in these governments? Is that undermining the democratization? Is it undermining the organizations like the OAS?
Always, always. Corruption now has become easier and harder. It's become easier because of technology. Very easy to wire money from one place to the next, hide money, money laundering, etc. But at the same time, it's easier to denounce it with social media, with all kinds of ways that you can expose corrupt people. So there is a stronger light shining on corruption, but it doesn't mean that corruption hasn't disappeared. And drug trafficking, money laundering, misappropriation of government funds, that continues. So we're still a long way from really putting a big
Right.
dent on corruption.
Do you think the corruption and that money laundering and the narcotics money is going to have a detrimental impact on those societies and
Oh,
those communities, or is it improving, or is it getting worse?
I think it is improving, but at the same time, it's a long way from being controlled.
Mhm.
I mean, I saw it when I served in the Bahamas
Mhm.
as a deputy chief of mission. We had the Bahamas has 700 islands, and at one point, 25% of the cocaine coming to the U.S.
Mhm.
was coming through the Bahamas. Uh, and we went to the Bahamian government to try to persuade them to fight these drug traffickers. And the initial line from many Bahamians was, well, it's not our problem. It's your problem.
Mhm.
It's a U.S. consumption that's driving. And they're partly right.
Mhm.
But our point was, that's true, but if you're a transit country, the cocaine is going to wash ashore into your beaches. People are going to use it. People are going to be bribed to look the other way. It's going to undermine your democracy and your society. So you get affected too. You have to fight it at the transit stage, at the consumption stage, and at the production stage.
Mhm.
What President Bush used to call the three-legged stool.
Mhm.
So eventually, the Bahamians got the message, and they helped us grab people like Carlos Leder and some famous drug traffickers who had taken over some Bahamian islands. And of course, what happens then when you squeeze the old balloon theory,
Mhm.
that if you squeeze the traffickers in one place, the balloon pops out
Right.
somewhere else, be it the Mexican border or
Right.
Central America.
Right.
So, but you have to keep squeezing a balloon until it pops.
So let's talk about Venezuela then, because that's a place where it
Mhm.
seems like there's a nexus of, problems like corruption, drug trafficking, populist dictators, if that's the right word to use. What can we do about Venezuela? What needs to be done about Venezuela?
Well, we have to continue to work with the democracies in the region to isolate Venezuela, to denounce
Mhm.
Venezuela. We have been sanctioning Venezuelan officials
Mhm.
so they can't go to Disney World every year like they would like to take their kids. And at some point, we have to consider whether we hit them where it hurts, and that's in the oil sector,
Mhm.
which the U.S. has been reluctant to touch that sector because it might have an adverse effect on the consumer, the U.S. consumer. But that would really hit Venezuela where it hurts. I think President Maduro has stolen, and you can't call him a dictator now,
Mhm.
because he has stolen a democratic election. He has done away with the opposition, which had taken over the Congress. He declared the Congress illegal and then had his own election,
Mhm.
a sham election. So we need to continue to denounce it, the Venezuelans. I don't think we should threaten military intervention as the president did, because that allows Maduro to rally whatever remaining support he has, and saying, I am the only thing standing between an American intervention and you. But we have to look for ways to force him out.
Right. Are there regional alliances then that can be used to put pressure
Well,
on Venezuela?
I think you have seen you're starting to see a sea change in the attitude of Latin American countries. Countries like Argentina, Peru, and others are denouncing Venezuela, which
Right.
that was an unspoken commandment, thou shalt not speak against a fellow Latin American nation.
Right.
And they're starting to do that. So we have to continue fighting for democracy
Right.
and supporting the brave people of Venezuela who are
Right.
fighting against Maduro.
Let's turn to migration issues.
Okay.
So what are the drivers of some of the mass migration that we're seeing?
If you're talking about Latin America, unstable conditions in Central America are a major driver. Honduras is a country with some of the highest murder rates of the world, with a presence of gangs, drug traffickers, etc. A country where the government really doesn't control much of the territory, and it's a pretty lawless place in many areas. The U.S. has tried to pump money into the region to help those governments fight these crimes. But sometimes our aid has not been well targeted. Sometimes the absorptive capacity of the countries is not there. So we have to be smarter as to how to help them. And there is a tradition after the Central American wars of Central Americans coming to the U.S. We had the TPS, the Temporary Protective Status, after Hurricane Mitch and other Central American disasters. And President Trump has done away with that. So you're going to see maybe some Central Americans trying to get in before the door closes altogether, et cetera. So that is a driver, the unstable conditions in that area. And you see it, Syria, areas of conflict, a massive exodus of Syrians into Europe and trying to get to the U.S. as well. So that's traditionally, you know, those who are not well off or fleeing injustice or fleeing conflict come to countries like the U.S. and Western Europe, et cetera.
So those domestic security issues, the insecurity domestically inside these countries are driving large numbers of people out. And you mentioned gangs. So is it really that there's criminal organizations are getting more powerful than the states? And you said the murder rate was really high. Is it simply the domestic security issues, or is there economic drivers as well?
Well, there is poverty.
Right.
There is, I mean, Haiti and Honduras are the two poorest countries of the hemisphere, Nicaragua. So those are drivers as well. But I think recently you've added insecurity to that. In Honduras, sometimes the fight, or Guatemala, the fight is between the drug traffickers and the gangs to see who's in control of a certain area with the government marginalized. So it is a very difficult problem.
Is the migration straining the relationships between the states? Certainly the U.S. and the countries that a lot of migrants are coming from, but what about internal to Latin America?
Well, certainly the rhetoric is has been off the charts. I mean, when a presidential candidate said the people who are coming from our neighbor to the south are all rapists, what kind of a message does that send? And the idea that free trade has not been beneficial to the U.S. also really puts these relations in a very tenuous state, because the main driver for positive relations between the U.S. and Latin America since 1992 has been free trade. We have free trade agreements with a large part of the hemisphere, with Mexico, with Central America, with some South American countries like Peru, Chile, and others. So if we're going to do away with that, that certainly will cause a retrenchment maybe in South America. Maybe they'll look to China and others to fill in the gap. So that's not a good thing in my view.
Right. So the relationships are strained by migration, but not necessarily the migration itself, but by the reactions to the migration.
Yeah, but you know, because you know the numbers actually have gone down. I mean, the number of crossings of the Mexican border have gone down in recent years. So the rhetoric is what has changed. Has been amplified. Everything.
Now the U.S., I guess, relations with Latin America have been described as periods of neglect and then periods of interference. Is that an accurate description?
It's complicated because sometimes we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. For example, for many years, after the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. was seen as a sort of a paternalistic, had a paternalistic influence on Latin America. But then that was coupled with wars with Mexico, interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, where not a very good image of the U.S. Was seen. And then FDR came in with a good neighbor policy saying, okay, we're not going to intervene. We're going to be a good neighbor, and you guys take care of yourselves. But then that led to dictatorships.
Mhm.
And then the criticism was, how can you
Right.
partner with these dictatorships, et cetera? And the famous phrase by FDR, he's an SOB, but he's our SOB, is now
Right.
seen as a very negative thing. So um, there is no magic formula in dealing with Latin America other than understanding, respect, and communication.
Right.
And we have to defend our interests for sure, be they trade interests or democracy, et cetera. But at the same time, in a smart way, and not in an overbearing, arrogant, ugly American kind of way.
Mhm.
We can work with those who are working for free trade, for democracy in the region, and we have many like-minded governments in the region. If
Right.
if we play our cards correctly, we can be more effective than just by insulting
Mhm.
and denouncing.
Right. Okay, so does a state have the right to protect its borders, defend its borders from a lot of this migration?
I think for sure. I mean, I think states have to control who come into their territories. That's, to me, that's a no-brainer. Now, at the same time, you have to consider that we are a nation of immigrants. And I happen to believe that we are enriched by the presence of immigrants. So to unilaterally close down the border without any logical reason, I don't think is smart. But we do have to be selective. We do have to protect. We do have the right to say who comes in. And we should have family reunification so people can be reunited with their families. But no question, the state does have the right to
Right.
control its borders.
Mexico.
Mhm.
How much of Mexico is in a crisis, and what should the U.S. do about it?
Well, Mexico is a country that still has tremendous poverty in some areas, but it certainly has come a long way, and I think it has benefited from NAFTA. I happen to think the U.S. consumer has also benefited from NAFTA. But NAFTA has not affected all areas of Mexico the same. I think in the north you see a middle class that has emerged and benefited from NAFTA. The south has not been as quick to receive the benefits of NAFTA. So, and in recent years, a problem has been the drug traffickers and the attacks on journalists, the rule of law. And I think this recent election, you saw the election of an outsider, López Obrador, who got 53% of the vote, which is unprecedented in recent Mexican elections. And by pledging to clean up. So is he another populist, or is he really someone who can make changes in the country? That's something that remains to be seen. But I think for now he's taken a very good attitude, has made good pronouncements, saying I'm not here to fight with the United States. We want to find common ground and work together, and things like that. So let's see.
Is there a different approach, or maybe a more effective approach, that the U.S. can take with Mexico to kind of prevent some of that narco trafficking and some of the spillover of the gang violence into the U.S. states?
Well, cut down the rhetoric. That's one thing. I think our agencies have had very good cooperation with Mexico in recent years. And in fact, Mexico used to never extradite drug traffickers to the U.S. You're seeing people like El Chapo and famous drug traffickers being extradited to the U.S. So cooperation has been there. So that should continue.
Okay.
They, of course, complain that many guns come in from the U.S. And they don't want to hear about the Second Amendment. So maybe there's something we can do in that score. Maybe regulate a little better the guns going south.
Is there a new regional alliance that needs to be developed or created for Latin America, or do you think that the alliances and the bilateral relationships are enough to deal with a lot of the problems that are there?
There has been a plethora of new groups, new alliances. I mean, you're talking about the OAS, you're talking about UNASUR, which are the South American countries without the U.S. Uh, you're talking about Chavez had his own organization called CELAC. The Summit of the Americas, which meets every 3 or 4 years, which encompasses the whole hemisphere. I think President Uribe of Colombia complained at one point that he'd had enough of summitry, and he was going to be selective in what summits he attended. So the organizations are there. It's the will and the of countries to get things done. That has been missing sometimes.
Okay. Let's look at NATO for a couple minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So is NATO effective outside of Europe, and is it a useful organization for security issues outside of Europe?
Well, I think in countries like Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
It has proven to be effective in bringing in some assets from Europe to help our effort in those countries, the so-called out-of-area deployments. Mm-hmm. I think maybe some members would disagree on whether some of these deployments should be made or not. Should it be only a European organization? But if there are threats to some of the countries, I think they should look at every problem. I do think NATO needs to be kept together, and needs to be stand up in places like the Ukraine and Crimea, where Russian naked aggression has been at play. But if NATO were to break up, that's a signal to Russia to maybe go after the former Soviet republics, especially in the Baltics. They're already trying to undermine some of the countries through, hacking and e-warfare and all that, like Lithuania and others. So we're NATO's the last best hope for the democracies in these countries.
So does NATO need to be bolstered? Does NATO need to be refocused on Russian aggression again? You see a rejuvenation of NATO?
Some NATO theoreticians say that maybe we moved too fast in bringing in some of the former Soviet republics, and Russia saw that as a threat. That, I think, is open to interpretation, and time will tell. But I think right now we have an aggressive Putin who's really, he's in Syria, he's going after the Ukraine, he's taken over Crimea. Then that's a reality that has to be dealt with right now.
So is NATO an effective tool for dealing with that, or is it?
I think it can be. Now, if NATO is undermined, if President Trump threatens to walk away from NATO and is going out of his way to reassure Putin, that may be a dangerous course to follow that might give the Russians an indication that they can get away with something that they shouldn't get away with.
Right. What about the EU and the relationship with the EU and NATO, and the friction, the overlap between EU forces and NATO forces? And
I think there's been a pretty good division of labor up to now. I mean, I haven't read about any recent conflicts in that score. The EU has its own problems now with Brexit and the backlash against Brussels that you're seeing in many countries, and populism is alive and well in many of these countries. Poland is taking some actions that seem to be anti-democratic, so the EU has enough problems keeping members in the fold right now.
Do you see the EU as coming apart, and it has reached its peak and now it's on the downfall? Or?
I don't know that it's coming apart, but certainly there is a lot of questioning. But I think even in Britain, you're starting to see that maybe Brexit wasn't the right answer right away. But there is a backlash against the bureaucrats in Brussels and how they can dictate the lives of large populations without being elected by the people.
Right. And migration seemed to be a catalyst for a lot of the, friction of the member states in Brussels. Is that justifiable? Is migration just a tip of the iceberg, or really was it a turning point?
I think a lot of people are worried about migration. And you saw it in Germany this past few weeks when the Merkel's coalition almost broke up over the issue. The prime minister, chancellor, was forced to make concessions to the CSU and others who want to control migration. So that is a very difficult issue because Europeans have always prided themselves of being welcoming to all countries and nationalities. And now the numbers are growing exponentially. So more and more people say something has to be done.
Right. And well, some have characterized the migration in Europe as a threat, as a real security threat. And it seems like it's straining some of the organizations, as regional alliances there, and it's straining some of the state governments. Is migration a threat, or what is it?
Well, it could be a threat if countries cannot take care of those large populations that are coming in. Also, the philosophy in every country is different. The U.S. tends to be more accepting of foreign cultures than others. In France, the idea was to make everybody French and to prevent, for example, Muslims from wearing the chador and some other in classrooms. So that, and we saw that in riots that took place in France and other places in Belgium, where the foreign-born populations, and even the children of the foreign-born felt marginalized, that they weren't being assimilated, included. So, I mean, these are new rules that are being written right now, and there is a lot of frustration on both parts, from some of the recent immigrants and from the older populations in these countries.
What do you think are some of the major lessons learned for, I'll say, migration? We'll start with migration.
We cannot be bystanders in major conflicts and world problems because they will have consequences, Syria being one. So, and we all need to coordinate together to decide what the best solutions are for all these problems. Countries cannot act alone. They continue to have to act together, and that's why the UN and NATO and these organizations are still key. But we have to be aware that these things can happen, and even in places like Burma with the Rohingyan populations being expelled into other countries. It's not only migrants going to the West. Some of them are being forced to go to underdeveloped countries. So it's going to be a problem. And we need to have good communication. We need to help refugee agencies, NGOs and others to take care of refugees. And we need to look at the conditions that cause people to leave.
What about lessons learned in grand strategy? What would you recommend for the U.S. to be more effective in achieving its interest overseas?
I think you have to look at the long term. I think what are U.S. interests? I mean, let's agree on what are U.S. interests. Economic well-being of the country being one, for example. So by making political points with trade wars and things like that, are you going to get the results you need for the economic well-being of the U.S.? I mean, that's a pretty dangerous gamble. How do you support democracy? I mean, is a threat on a democracy a threat on all democracies? That's something we have to come to terms with. How do we use all the tools in our arsenal? Are bad environmental policies in the region a threat to the United States or not? Are attacks on minorities in other parts of the world something we should not be involved in? So we have to look at strategies encompassing all aspects of our relations with other countries. Migration could be a strategic arm. I mean, we saw Cuba, for example, starting with the Mariel boat lift in 1980, turning the migration spigot whenever they wanted concessions from the U.S. That's something we should always keep in mind, that something that could happen. How do you stop it? In the case of Haiti, at one point, we had 17 Coast Guard cutters off the coast of Haiti when Haitians, decided to leave en masse,
Mm-hmm.
building rickety boats, which endangered people's lives. How do you stop that? So migration can be a weapon and something we have to look at as well.
Mm-hmm. What about regional alliances? What should the U.S. do to improve in its effectiveness in these regional alliances?
Well, we have to be credible partners. We can't just speak out of both sides of our mouth and one day say NAFTA is a bad agreement, so we should do away with it, and at the same time be negotiating how to make it better. What kind of a message are you sending to the negotiators? That their task is not appreciated, it's going to be fruitless, so might as well walk out? No, we have to be comprehensive. We have to be engaged. We have to be in the arena, like Teddy Roosevelt said. We can't just be an ostrich. We can't be isolationist. We can't just build a gigantic wall around ourselves and stick our head in the sand. It's a messy world, but we got to be in it. We got to be in the fight. We got to work with people who are like-minded and who believe in the same ideals we do, and fight the good fight.
So what about coalition warfare? Is that an effective approach to some of security issues, or does it just messy the activities?
Well, I think anytime you can get others to join you, it's more effective, because it's not just one nation imposing its will on somebody else. Well, you saw Secretary Pompeo coming out of the North Korean talks yesterday. The North Koreans said the U.S. is adopting gangster-like attitudes. What was Pompeo's response? Well, if the U.S. is a gangster, then the world is a gangster, because we all agree of what should happen in North Korea. You're a lot more effective and stronger when you have others behind you. That said, sometimes you have to negotiate more. And I remember the first Gulf War, when we did not go all the way to Baghdad, because that was not what we had organized or what other countries had signed up for, and we had to respect that. So you might lose a little bit in power and effectiveness, but I think in the long run, it's better when you have more than yourself involved.
Right. So you get credibility, you get legitimacy, you get additional resources, but are you able to achieve your objectives with so many different capitals, having a say-so?
That's true, but even if you achieve your objectives, remember that Clausewitz said that war never ends. And you might gain a victory temporarily, but then you might create such bad will that the children of the people you defeated are going to come back at you in a few years. So better to have a peace that's imposed by the world and others than just one country.
Is there any other comments that you wanted to make?
Diplomacy is key. This administration has gone out of its way to send a message that diplomacy is not important by not filling positions in the State Department. When Putin decided to send home a few hundred Americans with a dispute we were having with Russia, the president said, "You're doing my job for me." That's not a way to conduct foreign policy. That's not leadership, effective American leadership in this world. Diplomacy is key, and as General Mattis said, you better fund the State Department or give me a hell of a lot more bullets.
Right. So what should the U.S. do in terms of being more effective diplomatically?
Well, I think empower its diplomats. Make them, send them to all parts of the world, negotiate. When Secretary Tillerson was first negotiating with North Korea, the president tweeted he should not waste his time. And then he turns around and, goes the other way totally, wanting to. That's not a way to conduct foreign policy. And what kind of a message do you send to our diplomats, many of whom are resigning because they figure, in this new world, they're not important. So diplomacy is key because there's nothing like the person on the scene who knows what's going on. I think you can do a lot by tweeting and by email or social media, but it's not the same as a person who's on the scene living there and telling you, if you do this, this is going to happen. The internet cannot tell you that.
Right. So the improvements in communications may make it easier for the White House to actually directly communicate with those, foreign partners, but we lose the expertise and, like you said, the person on the ground
Right.
to really give good information.
Right.
So you think that trend is going to increase and that diplomats are going to be less and less useful
Well,
because the communications are going to be so
I would hope not.
effective?
We would do that at our own peril. I do see Secretary Pompeo trying to restore some of the, he calls swagger. I don't know if that's the correct word, but certainly the morale of the State Department, and by filling positions and by, sending messages, by respecting the state culture and the people and the advisors that he has.
So you think it's a result of the different administrations on how they use the Department of State, or do you think that there's other reasons why the Department of State is
Well, every administration comes in wanting to impose its vision and its agenda. And the State Department can be seen as a roadblock to that, because they're the guys who, in a discussion, will tell you, if you do that, this is going to happen. And people get frustrated. They say, oh, you're not with the program. You're not with the president. Well, our job is to tell you what 30 years of experience has taught us.
Right.
If you do A, then B might happen. And sometimes we don't check our assumptions. We have assumptions. Like MacArthur thought, if the Chinese intervention, let him come. In Korea, let him come. Because a Chinese soldier is no match to the US soldier and it will bomb him from the sky. Well, no. They came in surreptitiously and our assumptions were all wrong. So we have to check those assumptions and strategy. We can't just go with preconceived notions. And in order to check those assumptions, you need people who know what is likely to happen.
Right.
And you're losing that right now.
Right.
And in the intelligence agencies as well.
Thanks for sharing all of your experience and insight. Thanks for your expertise in the topics.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll have you here again, in the future.
Good luck to your students. Be kind to them.
Thanks.